Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Ryan, and welcome to Central Park. We're so happy to continue to be bringing the park to you through our in-person tours, as well as our virtual tours, both our 45-minute long programs, as well as our shorter, informal 15 to 20-minute weekly walks. Thank you for joining us on another Wednesday rendition of our weekly walks every Wednesday at 12:30, where we, of course, take you through various landscapes of the park, discussing ranges of history to present-day park beauty. And we have a special little walk for you today. While we will be exploring the landscape we probably visited more recently, we're going to be discussing something a little bit different. We're going to be discussing a favorite element of mine in the park, which are the beautiful trees. Now, many of you may be familiar that last month was Frederick Law Olmsted, Central Park co-designer's 200th birthday. April 26, 1822 to be specific. And of course, we had a bunch of wonderful specialty programs we were doing throughout that month. And one of them was Olmsted's Trees, talking a little bit about Frederick Law Olmsted, Central Park creator, as well as Prospect Park, Stanford University, Emerald Necklace of Parks up in Boston, and various other landscape creator. So today we're going to be exploring around a landscape known as East Meadow, which you probably are familiar with, but we're going to talk a little bit about Frederick Law Olmsted's plan for this landscape and what Central Park was looking like before the park was created. As always, we're going to be together for about 20 minutes today, and all the photos you're going to see were taken by myself here in Central Park over this past week. Luckily, on a little bit nicer of a day than we have today here in New York City, as it's a little wet and rainy out there. But of course, always a great time to explore through the park, even if we're getting a little wet as we walk. So thank you again for joining us on a weekly walk of East Meadow's Tree-Scape with me, Ryan, on today, May 4th, 2022. Now, as we begin our walk, I do just want to take a quick moment to give a special thank you to all of you. I know we say thank you a lot, but I wanted to give you a special thank you to all of you that join us on these weekly walks and make these walks so special. We absolutely love all the feedback we get, all of the comments, all of the emails, all of the handwritten letters, the pictures we get from kids on walks. All of the wonderful gifts that are sent in during the holidays. We can't thank you enough for all the support, all the people telling us in the park when they see us in person, how much these weekly walks have meant to them. We really can't thank you enough for joining us and creating such a special event for us. We want to let you know that when you do write in, all of these are certainly appreciated and they are noted. I know we don't have time to really respond to a lot of the kind words and comments that are written to us, but I do want to let you all know that we are certainly getting those messages. We are certainly seeing them, and I do apologize that we don't have the time to properly write back to you, but I just want to let you know that we really appreciate those. Continue to write in if you enjoy these walks. Even if there's something that you don't like about them, let us know, because we certainly love hearing from you and knowing what we're doing good and what we can do better. So thank you again for all the support and all the wonderful words that have come in. Now, as we begin our walk, of course, we are part of the Central Park Conservancy, a nonprofit who care for the park, keeping it clean and green, with our mission being to preserve Central Park and celebrate Central Park as a sanctuary from the pace and pressures of city life, enhancing the enjoyment and well-being of all. Now, as we make our way through the park today, we're using Zoom, so please let us know on a chat if you have any favorite features within the park, any favorite things in this landscape, or just in the park in general. Also, let us know where you're joining us from, because we'd love to hear that as well. If you do have a question, please use the Q&A feature, and my colleague Emily will be on the back end answering questions that you might have. You'll also see a visitor poll or two launched throughout the walk today, and once everybody has voted, I can share the results for those. The last thing you will see popping up on the bottom of the screen are going to be the live transcripts, which you do have the option to turn off using the live transcript or CC icon on your Zoom toolbar. Feel free to ask a question in the Q&A feature if you're having trouble turning those off. Now, without any further ado, let's begin our walk, which is going to focus around the East Meadow landscape, a landscape we visited not too long ago as Emily took you around this area. But rather than focusing on maybe the present day beauty of this landscape, we can talk a little bit about the plan for it. And as we begin our walk, we're going to be starting just outside the park at about 97th Street and 5th Avenue as we start to dive into the park on what was a sunnier day. A little bit different than today's weather, as it's a little overcast, but luckily not raining anymore. But as we make our way into the park, we don't even have to really enter the park to start enjoying some of the beautiful trees, such as the American elms that line 5th Avenue. Now, I'm sure we're all familiar with elm trees. There's certainly a remaining piece of America's past that was almost wiped out due to, unfortunately, human interaction and the spreading of diseases like Dutch elm disease. Luckily, we have some famous strands remaining in Central Park, like those that line the mall, as well as these that line Fifth Avenue. These about 9 total strands of elm trees make up some of the longest remaining elms left in North America. And they add a lot of beauty to our walk through the park, whether outside or inside. You'll often see a lot of elms surrounded by fences in the park. And that's because elm trees, while they are beautiful and grand, they're sensitive trees. And they do respond a lot to pollution as well as soil compaction. So walking over their very shallow roots can actually kill these trees. So we do tend to protect them however we can, such as distancing them behind some fences. Of course, to combat diseases like Dutch elm disease, you'll also see different cultivars and hybrids of these trees introduced in the park, as well as outside along Fifth Avenue. And seeing some of these younger trees coming in, really interesting to see the future generation of these towering giants that'll give us a little bit of shade and cover on Fifth Avenue, especially on rainy days like today, where we can use these trees as umbrellas. As we start to make our way into the park, we can trade some of those a little bit more modest, younger American elm trees for some of these towering pin oak trees. Pin oaks are amongst the most common trees in the park. Not the most common, but at about 1,400 to 1,500 mature pin oak trees, they are going to be the most numerous oak tree that you'll find, providing a lot of functionality for wildlife who certainly use their acorns as well as their large canopies for homes. These trees are really amazing, really helpful for New York because they're really fast growing trees that can deal with a lot of pollution as well as soil compaction, making them a little bit stronger than some of the American elm trees we have planted throughout the park. These trees are certainly beautiful, and we also see these trees being endowed. This plaque representing the endowment of these trees reminds me of a recent guest I was talking to who had the pleasure of endowing a pin oak tree down near Bethesda Terrace after their wife, Barbara. And I thought it was really amazing because pin oak trees, again, they might be more common in the park, but that doesn't mean that they're any less special. And again, one of the reasons these trees are so popular and so common is because they provide such a great use for wildlife, as well as for us, as they turn a brilliant yellow color during the fall and provide wonderful shade during the summer months. Certainly a wonderful gift to the park, as these trees help to provide a nice shady grove around the East Meadow landscape, which we're going to be walking around now. Now, you may be wondering as we begin our walk around East Meadow, why are we walking around an open pastoral field when we're talking about trees? The reason being is because this landscape, when we look at a Greensward plan map of Central Park, being an original map created back in 1858 of the plans for Central Park, we can see something interesting existing in this landscape. Now, the plan for Central Park changed a lot over its 160-year existence, even a lot during the initial construction of the park between 1858 and 1873. That highlighted section we're seeing on the right-hand side, if I zoom in, it's actually the area we're exploring today. And the reason we're talking about trees in this landscape is because the East Meadow landscape was originally designated as an arboretum by Frederick Law Olmsted, park co-designer. This arboretum was meant to capture a lot of beautiful American trees and shrubs being planted around this area and denoted by some of the numbers here, which relate to specific species. It's really amazing to think how the park has changed up over the years, but to think about some of the original landscapes like this one that was meant to highlight beautiful American tree species. As we explore this area today, we of course have plenty of beautiful species to see, like one that is sitting right in the middle of this path as we walk down, a tree that we're no stranger to, one of the most beautiful American elm trees found in Central Park. But to truly appreciate this elm's beauty, we have to walk out onto East Meadow. So as we make our way over onto East Meadow, we can enjoy the beautiful spread of this American elm tree. This tree being planted more spaced out along the meadow, as Frederick Law Olmsted intended, to give many of these trees really their own individual area to take over, like this elm, which has grown exactly as an elm should when it's given the proper room, growing wider than it is tall. And of course, the beautiful spread on this is just magnificent. Having some people sitting a little bit below the tree and walking underneath gives us the perspective of how large this towering giant is. One of the most magnificent trees you'll find in Central Park. and probably one of the oldest elm trees we'll find in Central Park. But a beautiful tree that also really has a lot of beauty to it, because even big trees like this need a little bit of support. Even the strongest of us need a little bit of help and need something to lean on every now and then, which is why, as you do a little bit of investigating in the canopy of this tree, you can find some suspension wires and cords that are helping to support this tree. Because of course, there's a lot of different ailments these trees have to deal with. Beyond diseases like Dutch elm disease and other things spread by people, they also have to deal with a lot of natural weather conditions, heavy ice and snowstorms, high winds, and different types of superstorms like Ida recently, which has certainly put a stress on many trees. Luckily, our wonderful arborists take care of all of the trees in the park, giving them the help and support that they need. As we start to make our way up on the Meadow area, I want to launch our first poll, which is, what do you think the most common tree found in Central Park is? Now, if you've joined us on certain tours before, you probably heard us mention what the most common tree in Central Park is. So I'll let everybody vote on that as we make our way a little bit north along East Meadow. And as we walk up here today, we can see some of those towering pin oak, honey locust, and elm trees that line the east side of the park and Fifth Avenue. They do a wonderful job of trying to cover up the city, but of course, no one would be able to predict how massive some of the skyscrapers and buildings of New York would eventually get to. But of course, they add a beautiful contrast with natural elements of the park and the urbanization of the city, something that we've come to love and appreciate here in Central Park. And as we walk up the path, when we turn our attention to the west, we can completely lose sight of all those buildings and get a much more natural view. As we walk a little bit up towards the west, we can notice some new additions to the already amazing cast of trees along East Meadow. These are some younger linden trees that are being put up here. Linden trees being a tree that is native to New York and one that was found in the pre-park landscape where Central Park was created. We can identify these based on their leaves, which have a lopsided heart shape to them. But an interesting tree, one that will add some diversity to the beech trees, elms, and various other species that line East Meadow. As we make our way along that west side of East Meadow, we can come up and see some reminders of what the park used to look like. The park was originally a very rocky and swampy place, being devoid of much grass and open pastoral fields like East Meadow, and also devoid of a lot of trees. Walking a little bit over to the west, we can see an idea of what the park may have initially looked like. A lot of rock outcroppings and maybe some more evergreen trees. We originally see the original landscape of Central Park looking very different, as this landscape originally had a lot more evergreen trees, like some of the fir trees we can see planted around here. We'd see Frederick Law Olmsted planting a lot of evergreen species because he thought they complemented a lot more the rocky landscapes, looking very reminiscent of the landscapes you'll find in upstate New York's Catskills and Adirondacks, which Frederick Law Olmsted visited a lot during his youth. Taking in that inspiration, we probably see him wanting to create a similar type of landscape here in the park, using the rocky landscapes to decorate with different types of evergreen trees like firs, spruces, and hemlocks. Unfortunately, though, we know the city is a little bit different than upstate New York, and the soil is a little bit different than the traditional black nutrient-rich soil that many of the evergreen species require. We'll also see the soil up there being a little bit more alkaline rather than the soil down here, which is more acidic and has a lot more pollutants, which would cause a lot of these trees to be lost over time. While unfortunately many of the evergreen species aren't in the same number they used to be in the park, we can see them returning in various areas. And of course, one thing was never lost, the large rock outcroppings that we can find all throughout Central Park that date back 450 million years old. But always a little bit of beautiful character they add to the park and the landscapes that exist throughout. As we make our way north, we can see something that would start coming into the park about 100 years ago, cherry blossom trees. Ornamental species were initially planted in the park as early as the 1850s or late 1850s, but we see cherry blossom trees really becoming popular around 1912, when shipments arriving to America being sent to Washington, D.C. and New York City would start the cherry blossom craze and the festivals that continue to this day. Kwanzan cherry blossoms are amongst the later blooming ones, and we can see these spread throughout the park with the highest concentration existing along the west side of the Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis Reservoir. But of course, a few scattered trees like this one provide a little bit of whimsical beauty as we explore around and catch a surprise like this. As we make our way past this cherry blossom tree, we can wrap under the shady branches of some other elm trees. And as we make our way up, I will end that first poll. So I'm going to share the results, and I see a lot of people have selected a London plane tree. That is a very good answer. Unfortunately, it's not the correct one, but very close. London plane tree is the most common street tree you will find in New York City. So many of them that they actually are trying not to plant any more in New York City streets for a while. It's very, very common in Central Park as well, and certainly is in, I would say, probably the top 3 to 5 most common trees in Central Park. However, the correct answer for this one is, drum roll, a black cherry tree, which is actually the least selected answer on here. A black cherry tree is the most common tree you'll find in Central Park. You can imagine because it produces cherries and birds love them. So those cherries will be eaten by wildlife and spread throughout the park naturally growing and germinating new trees, which is why they're the most common tree in the park and one that we don't plant, but rather often remove more than we would plant them. But interesting guesses there. Great work, everybody. But I do have one more for you that might be a little bit of a trick question as well, but great guessing. So as we continue around, I'll again share those results, and we'll continue through the park as we make our way a little bit north now, crossing over the 102nd Street entrance to the park and making our way towards the northern extent of East Meadow, around this landscape that again originally was an arboretum for the park. One thing that's interesting to think about is, again, what the park looked like prior to the construction of the park we know today. We see the park, again, being a very rocky, swampy landscape and being planted with a lot of evergreen species initially. However, we do see the park having a pretty different type of species collection prior to its construction. And we know this because a plant survey was done. Frederick Law Olmsted would select Ignaz Anton Pilot, who would become the chief gardener of Central Park, to conduct a plant survey in which they would identify several different species that were native to the park, and some that were not native. One that's not native that was actually found in the pre-park landscape we can find up here today. It's called a paper mulberry tree. And mulberry trees, we do see some common ones that are native to the area like white and red mulberry, but paper mulberry is actually native to Japan. This is a tree that has an interesting history with it. One that was found in the pre-park landscape, but one that's not native to New York. So it's interesting to see really how much the landscape was manipulated before Central Park even was created. Paper mulberry trees are pretty interesting. We can see here actually a little section from the original plant survey of Central Park, which occurred between 1857 and 1858. We can see that this tree is again native to Japan, and there were about 500 specimens found here. Now, one of the reasons we might expect to see so many of these trees that's not native here is because of its use, which was probably part of industry. We actually see paper mulberry being used to create a product known as bark cloth. We can actually see an example of bark cloth here, this being a Tongan bark cloth with some ornamental designs in it. Now, bark cloth, which can be made from the bark of this tree, basically creates a kind of paper textile material. This was something that was used prior to the invention of parchment paper from animal skin. So we do see this being used for early paper, early documentation, early clothing, and even for canvas and art. We eventually see this not really being used as much anymore as textiles and different fabrics started being produced. But this would be an early predecessor to the parchment paper that we see being used on a lot of historical documents. But really an interesting creation and one that we still find here present in the park. As we continue walking a little bit north, we'll be coming to our last location or two on our walk today. And as we explore up the park a little bit, we'll pass by a favorite quaint little landscape of mine, one that exists just in between East Meadow and the Conservatory Garden, a nice sweeping hillside that has a little bit of rock beauty and a lot of tree beauty. And as we walk up the hill a little bit, we'll pass by a horse chestnut tree. A horse chestnut tree over here. Sorry, actually buckeye tree over here. This is a buckeye. I'm not sure if it's a yellow buckeye or not, but we can certainly see some beautiful flowers beginning to come in on this buckeye tree. one that should be blooming in the next few days, giving us a later spring flower to look forward to. But of course, a lot of beauty to see in some of these native trees that exist throughout this originally planned arboretum. As we walk up the park, we can also see some native trees like eastern redbud, a favorite of a lot of people. I always find it interesting too that this arboretum was meant to house native trees. When we think of an arboretum today, I think we think of a lot of times a like botanical garden, like the Brooklyn Botanical Garden, or somewhere that hosts a lot of exotic plants. But again, this arboretum was meant to host native plants like this eastern redbud. As we come up through the park today, we can see though that the area today has evolved a little bit and also hosts some non-native plants like that paper mulberry, as well as these dawn redwoods. Dawn redwoods are not native to this East Coast New York area, but rather over on the West Coast. You'll find these trees growing in various areas towards California, in some of the redwood and sequoia forests where very large trees grow. But these trees are very similar to a native one we have nearby called the bald cypress, which typically has a little bit more of a southern range along the East Coast. But a deciduous coniferous tree, meaning it has needles, which we typically see on evergreen trees, but it loses those needles during the winter time. We can see a little grove of dawn redwoods over here, because this area also tends to serve as sort of a tree nursery, as some of these species begin their life here before potentially being transported to a different area of the park. And some trees do very well when being transported. One tree we can see up here is growing alone by itself, looking like it's sticking out of this rock face. This tree is one that we're probably pretty familiar with, although might not be easy to tell since the leaves haven't fully come in yet. When these leaves do come in, this tree will be pretty easy to identify. This is a sassafras tree. And looking at this photo that my colleague Jose took last year in August for a weekly walk of the Great Hill, we can see the variation amongst its leaves, which have 3 different shapes present on the leaf at the same time. A smooth kind of palm-shaped leaf, as I like to call it, pictured here on the right. We can see just to the left of that leaf, a mitten-shaped leaf. And then the last of the leaves, the one pictured here towards the left middle, I can never really do it, but the Star Trek leaf. So if you could remember those 3 hand symbols, you can easily identify sassafras when it's leafed out, that is. But a very beautiful tree, one that is used to make things like root beer, as well as a lot of different perfume and oil products. It's also a very interesting tree that was found in high numbers in the park. Now, this is a tree that actually was very commonly found in the park. I actually forgot to launch my last poll before showing you this one. I'll launch it anyway, but you'll be able to very easily get this answer. But the question I have for you is, what do you think was the most common tree found in Central Park? Now, during that original plant survey, there were about 36 species of trees found in the park, with a handful of them being non-native, like paper mulberry, but also a handful of native ones. Surprisingly, some of the most common trees in the park or in New York were actually not found in the pre-park landscape. But I'll let everybody vote in that again, which have the answer to for this one because I forgot to launch the poll early enough. But we can see the most common tree found in Central Park of the past was common sassafras. Now, sassafras, which we can see on this little snippet from one of the first annual reports plant surveys, we can see that this was listed as being the most interesting tree in the landscape, as well as being found with about 20,000 specimens. 20,000 sassafras trees in the park. Now, there probably weren't 20,000 sassafras trees in the park. And that's because sassafras has an interesting way of growing. It creates clones or shoots that pop up from its trunk or from different rooted areas that spread out. So we can see sassafras creating groves of what look like dozens or hundreds of trees. But ultimately, many of these trees are connected by the same root system. Separating them will make them their own individual growing tree, but they're all spawning from the same tree and many a times are connected during the process on the same root system. So ultimately, they could be really just 1 or 2 trees that's creating what looks like hundreds of trees. So we can imagine some of the early trees coming into the park that were identified as sassafras, they may have really just been coming from a handful of parent trees. but really interesting to think about. This is one of the few areas we'll see self-standing sassafras trees, because often we find these taking up groves within woodlands like the Northwoods, where we can find a few beautiful ones. But really interesting to think about how different the park has progressed over the years. While today we learned the most common tree in the park are black cherry trees because of that wonderful cherry, as well as the most common street tree in New York City being the London plane, which is not native to here, but rather native to Europe. As we come to the end of our tour, we can think about again the progression of the park and how things have changed a lot. The area we're coming up to is known as the Mount, and it originally hosted a convent or a sisterhood for the Sisters of St. Paul de Vincent, who had a convent existing up here, which would later be moved to the Bronx after the park would be created, and this land would be taken for park use through eminent domain. We do see that sisterhood relocating to the Bronx, where they're still active today. We would see eventually a kind of cafe rest stop opening here, known as McGowan's Tavern, existing for some time into the early 1900s, before eventually burning down and catching fire. We do see that building being reconstructed, but eventually torn down, with a lot of change in the landscapes existing. But eventually the Mount would become known and become used as our composting area in the park. Beyond composting, this also serves as a nursery where many trees get to begin their lives. Some, like we saw the dawn redwoods, being planted just outside. Some trees that fall in the park being turned into wood chips to help continue the support and life cycle for others, with others even being used for rustic architecture and becoming used to support us as we sit in the park and enjoy its beauty. As we use this area for various purposes, we also get to repurpose just about everything that comes into the park, like much of the different soil. We can see here pictures of composting with a trommel being used, which allows us to create a very rich soil, much of which is used to support countless different species of trees, both native and non-native. And of course, today Central Park hosts such an amazing collection of trees. While there are about 100 species wildly growing throughout New York that are native, we'll find upwards of 175 species here in Central Park, which certainly help to add to the park's character and its aesthetic beauty. And as we explore the park, of course, there's so much to enjoy and to love. And we want to thank you for helping to support the park and help to support us so we can care for all of these 18,000 mature trees and countless amazing diverse landscapes. As we come to the end of our tour today, I want to again thank you for joining us on this wet New York day as we stroll through the park and learn a little bit about the trees of the past. I want to again thank you for all your comments, emails, letters, and everything you do, joining us and reaching out and telling us again how much these programs mean to you. We really hope you keep writing and keep letting us know what we're doing well and what we're doing bad, so we can improve and keep these programs going. As we do come to the end, I do want to again thank you for your support and remind you there's countless different ways to support the Conservancy. With Mother's Day coming up and all these various holidays, consider possibly getting a gift from the Central Park shop. All of that money going directly back to supporting the park. We do want to give you a little discount code here. If you do use the code WELCOME10 on any purchases, you can get 10% off. And the gift shop does ship worldwide. You can also stop in the park, mention the code. We can help you out there. But we really appreciate, again, the support on our virtual programs, in-person programs, and throughout all of the various activities we host throughout the park, from concerts to gift shops and things of the sort. Thank you so much again for joining us today. If you do check in the chat, my colleague Emily will be dropping some links about some various upcoming programs like our events page, as well as a link for the shop for anybody that's interested in checking out some of the Central Park products. But thank you again, everybody, so much for joining us. I'll leave this chat open for just a few more moments in case anybody has any last-minute questions. But otherwise, thank you so much, and we'll see you soon. Thank you so much for joining us, everybody.